Hello and welcome all back to Election Time News America. Today we're going to be going over the Republican best case scenario for 2026. This is the ceiling for the Republicans for 2026. Basically, this is only able to be this high because it is still a year and a half out. So, in mind, this is very, very hypothetical, and there is basically zero chance this will happen. This is the furthest out possibility. So Election Time News is your one-stop for all things elections and politics, from summations to poll reviews and news on elections and politics in general. Subscribe below for more content like this about American, Canadian, and Australian politics. Remember, there's never a dull moment in politics. Now, getting into the video here, we do have our base maps for the governors and senators. Now, for the governors, I don't have any numbers for the outcome of New Jersey or Virginia. Most likely, based on how things are looking right now, it's going to be blue for both of them, but I do not have their numbers included in the count. So when I have this all filled in, the two numbers here will only add up to 48. And in the Senate, we do have 34-31 with the complete blank Senate map. In the House, this is an expanded competitive version of the House, including some seats that were just barely safe, but would go likely in a wave year, not included on here. So, with all that in mind, let's start with the governorships. So, looking back in 2022, we do have a very narrow win in Oregon. Oregon doesn't necessarily elect even their Democratic governors by all that much, but there is an incumbent thing here, so that would probably end up being lean at best. There was a poll out of California that did have a very high perception that many Californians would be willing to elect a Republican governor. Now, the methodology is a bit questionable, but assuming that could end up going, we could end up with another Arnold Schwarzenegger. That would be the first flip of the night, would be in California, would be a Republican candidate there. You'd probably end up just barely losing Los Angeles, then you'd end up winning, more up here in San Francisco area and in Sacramento, just enough to end up flipping the state as a whole. Lombardo would storm a second term. I did have him losing in my Democratic scenario, but he's a very popular governor, and Nevada is moving to the right, so most likely he will actually win in 2026 as of right now. He would absolutely win in the Democratic best case scenario. Hobbs has had, Kelly is the senator. Hobbs has had some difficult polling recently on her likability across the state, so I wouldn't be too surprised if this actually does end up flipping. That would be a second flip there. That is going to be another flip on the night. Most likely, New Mexico won't flip, but it would get very, very close. It would potentially take a long time to end up counting out the victory there. Grisham, not necessarily a candidate that would need to be concerned much. Hawaii's just gone for the Republicans. Alaska would definitely go another safe margin here. Dunleavy is not an viable candidate, even though I think that he is term limited, though. That would probably be a strong Republican performance there. Same thing in all of these states. Kansas, Kelly is done, so there's not much to be done there as well. So Texas, Abbott is going to run for a fourth term, which is very, very uncommon in Texas politics, but he's very well liked there. He won, of course, against O'Rourke by 11 points. So considered to be a strong candidate, a fundraising behemoth, still lost by 11% in Texas. So Abbott is most likely going to win by a very large amount in 2026. Colorado, Polis is relatively well liked. I don't know whether or not he's actually term limited or not. I think he flipped it, but yes, term limited, but still, it could potentially get down to likely, but I don't think it's going to go much worse than that. Tim Walz, it's a very blue state, so I think if anything, it'd be just under 2 points, but it would still be a win for him. Wisconsin doesn't like to elect their governors for a third term. Evers is pretty well liked in the state of Wisconsin. but I wouldn't necessarily say it'd be impossible for him to lose. In a best case scenario for the Republicans, they would absolutely flip this seat into their column. In Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer is term limited, and so that would get this an open seat right here. Michigan's also been moving towards the right, so I wouldn't necessarily be surprised. The Republicans could probably flip this one too on a very good night. Depends on their election night turnout, especially in that region, if they end up having a strong automotive industry especially, which would affect this down here in Detroit as well as the Senate seat. Iowa, Reynolds is going to easily win, which means that they will have a majority. They will not hold a majority, though, because of those two that are left, but they will most likely hold a majority, but of course they will, because they do have safe in Vermont, assuming that Scott does run again, and then Ayotte will probably run for another term, probably re-election by a strong margin, because she is an incumbent. Illinois, Pritzker is pretty popular. I don't think they have term limits in the state of Illinois. Does not have gubernatorial limits. Yep, so he will run for re-election there, probably by a safe margin, but in a really, really good night, it could potentially get down to likely. I don't think this one's going to flip red, though. That would take a lot. Moore is probably going to win re-election in Maryland. Massachusetts, very blue state. Same thing for Rhode Island and Connecticut. Those aren't necessarily to be in any question there. Maine, this one is a term-limited state, so there's that in question, but I don't necessarily think that even in a good year, unless incumbent senator drops down to, which I don't know why they would, dropped down to the governorship level, I don't think this is necessarily going to be anything close to competitive still. It would get down to very low single digits, definitely under 5. Hochul could lose in a very, very bad night for the Democrats. This would flip New York, which would be huge, and that would show continued rightward trending in the state of New York. This would definitely show anger against Kathy Hochul, which has definitely also been seen continually as well. This would be the 5th flip of the night, and that is also the last one, because Josh Shapiro is a very popular governor, so even on a bad night, I think it would just be under 5 for Shapiro. He's very well liked in the state of Pennsylvania, has a very strong approval rating even amongst Republicans. I can't see him losing in 2026. It could get very, very narrow, potentially down to about 3, but he won by almost 15 in 2022. So I really don't see this one getting that close. Mastriano was a weak candidate. He's a strong one, so that definitely expanded things, but even in a strong red wave year with that incumbency status, I don't see that one holding up. DeWine, I forget who, I'm not sure if there's any current people looking into it, but there's definitely a lot of people, Ramaswamy is looking into it, but Ramaswamy has declared he is going to be running, so assuming that he could definitely end up winning this seat, depends on how he portrays himself in the public eye. Florida, a lot would have to go wrong for him to lose this in the first place, but Republicans will probably hold on to that one. And in Georgia, you could potentially end up seeing a Republican insurgence. You would end up having to have a very low margin because it is still a very left-trending state, but it could hold on probably for one more cycle for a Republican governor who would then have the incumbency advantage in 2032. So for the final governorship map, you would actually end up having 5 flips towards the Republican Party, 31-17, assuming that the best case scenario in 2025, that would be 32-18. That would probably be Virginia going red and then New Jersey staying blue. Best case would be both going red, but New Jersey would be very, very close. It depends on how Yonkers ends up going and turning out there. So and as well as Jersey City and a bit in Camden. And so, all that in mind, that would probably end up being the final map there, 31-17, with whatever ends up happening in 2025 later this year. So, for the House, it's a very, very narrow margin. We do have the official results finally now in Florida's 1st and 6th. Much, much narrower, but assuming that this is going to be then a red wave year, it doesn't matter whether Golden ends up running up or not. Assuming he does, let's assume that he does go up. That would be a better shot for the Republicans. So for that reason, I'm going to say that he does, which means that he will end up losing this in general, right? So, but even though, let's assume that he doesn't. So, assuming that he doesn't, that would be a lean margin, probably at worst. He did manage to hold on in a red wave year. In New Hampshire, this is going to be an open seat most likely, assuming that he does officially end up running for Senate, so that could probably end up being a flip right there. But assuming that Goodlander doesn't, that's probably going to end up being lean at worst. It was already a pretty bad year again in 2024, so there's not much worse that can happen for the Democrats, but there definitely is a few that could end up moving back completely. So there's still a bit to look back on. In Connecticut, this was assumed to be a competitive seat, but then he ended up winning by 6. So again, I don't think this was going to get very bad. It could end up getting pretty darn close, but necessarily Lawler would definitely win by double digits, especially if the governorship flipped. That wouldn't even be close. You'd probably end up seeing these on Long Island flipping as well. So probably one of these would be tilt, one of these would be lean, or lean and likely potentially. Mannion probably is going to end up winning this seat just because it's very gerrymandered again. If you look at this difference between 2022, they then redrew the maps to be more Democratic friendly, unfortunately, which is very disappointing to see. But Riley could probably end up losing that seat, flipping back to the Republican Party, potentially Molinaro, right? That would be the third time that they will run against each other, and the third time it would flip, which would be really funny, honestly. Going into Jersey, if we still end up seeing more rightward trends around New York City like we saw this time, we could definitely end up seeing potentially even this seat going likely, and then we could end up seeing Powell actually losing, I think, because it was an open seat, which is the only reason that it got down this low in the first place. But if we end up seeing a lot more rightward movement in these regions, we could end up seeing much closer margins, especially in these sorts of regions. Keene would definitely win by over 10 in this scenario. That wouldn't even be close. Zooming in on Pennsylvania, the only semi-competitive one that would go blue at this point would be the one north of Pittsburgh here, and that would be under 5 points. You'd end up having probably likely for these other ones, especially if you end up having these working class regions continuing to move to the right, and the area around Harrisburg, there'll probably be less because it's not as concentrated on these working class regions. But this would be assuming a large working class movement, which would mean that you'd also get better numbers in this central region down here. You'd probably end up potentially Madeline Dean might end up winning by just over 10, for example. McBride is definitely going to end up winning in Delaware. Now she has the incumbency status there as well, so that's going to help. The direct outer DC region is moving towards the left, so I don't see these guys actually winning or losing, especially in Loudoun County, Virginia, for example. Potentially Virginia's 7th might flip, since this is the more southern part, which is going to be the more richer, more Republican area, but I actually don't see this seat moving much to the right. It'd probably end up going closer to 2 points, but I don't see him losing there, but that would still be a gain for the Republicans out of Virginia, and Kiggins would end up winning by over 5 in this scenario, almost undoubtedly. Davis would probably end up losing in North Carolina, and over here, this would probably go under 10 in a very strong Democratic year, but considering it's Republican year, that is going to probably go by over 15. No competitive seats in South Carolina or Georgia. Thanks gerrymandering on that one. That's a relatively strong Republican seat. You could probably end up actually seeing very, very, very narrow margins just holding on by the fact that they're an incumbent there. So assuming that she does drop out, which would be best case, then you could potentially end up seeing this same candidate, Kaufman. If Kaufman were to run again, then potentially you could end up seeing that they could end up winning there. You'd end up having Luna winning by over 10, just barely evaded that this time. In Alabama, probably under 5 in this other district. Figures just barely won by under 10, so actually probably be likely, just narrowly, they're probably close to 6 points based on that. Going up into Ohio, you'd have a flip here in the 9th district. Captor would lose here. That'd probably be a right trending area. Landsman, this is depends on how the outer Cleveland region continues to move. That'd probably end up being lean at the end of the night. I don't see that one flipping necessarily. Sykes could potentially lose this one. It would be very, very narrow, but it would depend on the working class region over in this chunk. There's a band right here where there's a lot of working class voters across the border here, and that includes in Ohio County, West Virginia, where Wheeling is. And speaking of working class voters, we're going into northern Detroit. This is definitely going to be a strong spot for the Republicans. 18's just barely over where we go to likely, but James would definitely win by over 10 in this scenario. Not even a question. Barrett would win by a likely margin, and that means that we are at 217, which means that now, in order for the Democrats to win the majority, they'd have to win every single remaining seat, which is not going to happen. Most likely McDonald Rivet would end up losing that seat just narrowly and managed to win by 6.6. So that would mean 218, which means that the Republicans would have a majority. They would win 2 more seats here in order to expand on that majority now. This is going to be 9.9, so I actually don't see that one going, especially with how we saw Flint, Michigan move to the left recently. Van Orden would win by a relatively high margin in Wisconsin in the 3rd district, only won by 2 3/4 this time. In Minnesota, most likely Craig would win by a likely margin. It would go back down a bit. Nunn would probably actually win by a safe margin. Miller Meeks ends up actually performing relatively poorly, but then ends up winning on those very small margins. So I'd probably see lean to maybe likely, probably right around 5 points. That's interesting. Right around 5 points there. And on it being safe, I had that one just barely go likely in the Democratic scenario, but definitely ended up being very strong safe in this one. Same thing for the 15th district. 34th, that would probably end up flipping, albeit narrowly, for the Republicans. Same thing for the 2nd district of New Mexico. Vasquez won by 4.2 in 2024, so that would probably be a very narrow loss there. In Arizona, we'd have a strong win for Siscomani. Zooming in here, we would have Schweikert win by a strong bit there. And then in here, Stanton would probably win by a very narrow amount, quite a bit less than done before. Bigich would win by a strong amount in Alaska. Strong re-election campaign. Hurd would win probably by a double-digit amount in Colorado, and Evans would win by a likely margin in Colorado as well. Bacon would manage to hold on for another term here in Nebraska's 2nd district. Even as it continues to move to the left, he would probably end up managing another term there. It's going to be a likely margin in there. Zinke would end up winning by a safe margin in Montana. He won by 7.7 this cycle. Moving into Washington, Camp Perez. This is generally these districts end up actually. I mean, it was red in 2020, but that was, of course, before redistricting was done. So it had a bit more red regions in it as well. So I'd have to say that this one's probably going to end up being very, very narrow win for the Democrats. However, Bynum, I would have losing here in Oregon's 5th district. So then going down, I'm actually going to skip over to Nevada real quick before we end up, before we finish up with California. Most likely the 3rd district would be the first one to flip. That would probably be a lean margin. And then it's going to be the 4th with 8.1%. Just because there's a lot more rural regions, you could potentially have strong turnout. Here's going to be more centered around the actual Vegas area. So you probably have a light flip there and then a narrow hold in central Vegas. This is probably actually more plausible, you might think, because of the rightward trend in the state of Nevada. Now we end up finishing out with the state of California, 8 more districts left. Then we would have the 9th district in California. That would flip probably narrowly, probably just less than 2 points. Gray would definitely end up losing. He narrowly won this time. And we'd end up having a safe district in Valadeo, winning by over 10 in the 22nd district of the state of California. Down in the 27th district, we'd have more minority shifts towards the Republicans. That could easily actually end up flipping that one. Meant to do lean, even though it was 2 3/4 points for white sides this time. 21st district would end up being safe this time. Levin would probably end up just narrowly losing. That's more of a white area, so that's not those huge shifts we've been seeing, but this is more of a minority one, so that'd probably end up being lean, as well as the fact that they won by less. And then Tran, the final one, I believe this was actually the last House district to be called this cycle, and that would, in fact, flip red for a final total of 243 to 192 in the House, which is a very large majority here. 243 is actually a larger majority than the Democrats had in 2018, and it's actually 2 more than the Republicans had in 2016. So as far as the House is concerned, this would be the best Republican year since 2014. They did lose a few seats in 2016, and so from there, of course, they absolutely would end up actually having better chances now to pass Trump's legislation than they did in 2016 when he was first elected. So that would be a very tough time for the Democrats being able to pull things off here. That would absolutely be a mandate of many sorts. And so finally, to finish things off in the Senate, Oregon would be the first one to look at here. We're going to start on the West Coast again. Merkley's probably going to end up winning. Probably could end up getting down to a likely margin. That would be concerning, though, honestly. Definitely a safe margin in Alaska. These guys are all safe now, assuming that, Osborne doesn't run. That wouldn't even be competitive. Tester doesn't come back. Not competitive. Kelly decides to keep on her decision. Not at all competitive. Nobody's going to end up really running in Texas. Mississippi, Alabama, all these guys. The governor doesn't end up running in Kentucky. West Virginia, Iowa. Nobody really ends up running in Ohio. And then congratulations, the Republicans are now guaranteed the Senate majority. So then you end up going into Florida, and this could be potentially if Ron DeSantis ends up running, that wouldn't even be anything close to competitive in the first place. Colorado is going to be the first one to look at. Hickenlooper did flip this one in 2020. It was a long-running Republican. Actually, no, only narrowly beat out incumbent Udall from 2008 in red year 2014, but then Hickenlooper did flip it back into the Democratic column in 2020 for a narrow Senate majority, which is how Kamala Harris got the most tie-breaking votes in the Senate in vice presidential history. So it's because it was a 50-50 Senate split. And then I guess there was probably one Democratic defector quite a bit of the time. The one flip being in Pennsylvania. Fetterman beat Oz by just under 5%. So, back to 2020 again. Hickenlooper would probably actually end up having right about the same margin. Generally, incumbents improve on their previous margins, but this would be an exception to that. Lujan would probably end up winning by just under 5, considering the fact that won by 6.1 last time. Minnesota, I still do think would probably end up going blue. Smith is retiring, but it's such a blue state that most likely Minnesota would end up going blue anyways. Durbin is relatively popular, probably would end up at worst being right around Kamala Harris's margin in Illinois, 10.1. Warner would probably end up winning by just under 10 in this scenario, very popular. Coons in Delaware, no real concern there. Massachusetts and Rhode Island, those are both safe there. Booker in New Jersey, now that would probably end up being likely at worst. Depends on the turnout in the outer New York City area. Tillis would definitely end up winning by a likely margin in a good scenario for the Republicans, potentially even safe in a very strong show out there. Ossoff would end up losing probably by a likely margin, only likely because he is the incumbent and it is still a left-trending state, but there he would absolutely end up pulling off the win, de-seating Ossoff. Whoever ends up running, potentially if Kemp ends up deciding to run anyways, even though he announced that he will not run in that Senate seat. Peters would end up losing in Michigan, probably only by a lean margin, but there's no real standout candidate right now, so there's only lean, but assuming there is a really good one, it could potentially get really, really close to 5 points. I don't think it'll go over 5 points for the Republican no matter what, but in theory it could. Shaheen dropping out, so now Sununu could potentially end up scooping that seat up. That'd basically be safe for him there. That'd be likely, probably at best. And then in Maine, you would have Susan Collins end up winning a strong next term. Not really much contest there. So to finish things off would be 56-44 in the Senate for Republicans. 31-17 minus Virginia and New Jersey for governors, and 243 to 192 in the House. Thank you for watching the Republican absolute best case scenario. Hope you all enjoyed, and make sure to subscribe for more content like this. And thank you all for watching, and have a fantastic rest of your day.